As Mr. Nichols has explained, Mr. Duterte and his co-perpetrators agreed to this plan in Davao City. Photos of the co-perpetrators in Davao City are displayed on your screens. They're a combination of trusted police officers, an individual from Mr. Duterte's mayoral office, an officer from the National Bureau of Investigation in Davao Region, and a lawyer who acted on behalf of certain members of the Davao Death Squad. In 2016, when Mr. Duterte became president, the members of the Common Plan remained largely the same. They were joined by a further two individuals, a senior police officer and a long-time colleague of the group from Davao City, who had worked with the DDS before the jurisdictional period. I will take your honours through some of the evidence which shows both the scope of the Common Plan and the co-perpetrators' agreement to it. In the interest of time, I will address some co-perpetrators and we rely on our brief for the rest. That's at paragraphs 9 to 23 of our brief. On your screens is a photograph of Mr. Ronald De La Rosa. When Mr. De La Rosa was Davao City Police Chief, he developed Tokhang operations. As your honours have heard from Mr. Jeremy, Tokhang was a blueprint for police to implement killings later in the presidential period. When he was announced as Mr. Duterte's chosen PMP chief in May 2016, Mr. De La Rosa gave this interview, which is at tab 101. It shows that he wholeheartedly agreed to the Common Plan.
Patayan sa drugs. Patayan talaga ito sa drugs. Kayong mga drug lord dyan, humanda na kayo at talagang sasagasaan ko kayo.
On this slide is a photo of Isidro La Peña. Like Mr. De La Rosa, Mr. La Peña was well known to Mr. Duterte because he too had worked as Davao City Police Chief. In his case, from 1996 until 1998. In 2016, Mr. Duterte appointed Mr. La Peña as Director General of the Philippine Drug Enforcement Agency, or PDEA. PDEA is the lead anti-drug enforcement agency in the Philippines. 2 days after Mr. La Peña took his oath, he gave a speech to his PDEA subordinates. There is an excerpt from that speech on the slide. Quote, "Under then Mayor, we implemented strict law enforcement against illegal drug activities in Davao City. The President wants to replicate and expand what is being done in Davao. And that is precisely what I intend to do." End quote. That's tab 101. Also like Mr. De La Rosa, Vicente Danao was Davao City Police Chief during the mayoral period, in his case from 2013 to 2016. In November 2018, he was appointed Police Chief of Manila Police District, and he told reporters, quote, "If I discover anyone involved in drugs, especially those who distribute or just throw them around, son of a bitch, I will go after you, goddamn. I will kill you. Blatantly, I am saying that. Sons of bitches." End quote. That's tab 96. When Mr. Duterte became president, he appointed Vitaliano Aguirre II as Secretary of Justice. Mr. Aguirre has also publicly acknowledged the Common Plan and his agreement to it as a member of Mr. Duterte's administration.
Well, which do you want? We build first, do we build the prison facilities first, or do we go against these people? Choose. If you're in the Philippines, we will choose to kill these drug lords.
Quote, "In the Philippines, we will choose to kill these drug lords." End quote. That's tab 125. Your Honours, these speeches of co-perpetrators show both the scope of the Common Plan and those co-perpetrators' agreement to it. Your Honours, the next element of indirect co-perpetration is control of a structure of power. In the mayoral period, Mr Duterte and his co-perpetrators controlled the DDS, which they used to pursue the common plan. There is a diagram of the DDS hierarchy on your screens. As the Mayor of Davao City, Mr Duterte sat at the apex of the formal and city structures. The law gave him formal operational, supervision and control over the police in Davao City. In addition to this de jure power, insider witnesses spoke about his de facto power over police and the DDS structure. Under Mr Duterte were a combination of co-perpetrators from the Davao City Police Office and the Mayor's Office. Together with Mr Duterte, they controlled the DDS teams beneath them. They controlled the will of the DDS perpetrators through a range of mechanisms. And these are set out in paragraph 38 of our brief and include threats to kill and actual killing. To illustrate this control, there are quotes from one witness on your screen. This witness said that when he was first told to kill, he did not want to. But, I quote, "I felt like I didn't have any other choice but to follow their orders. Duterte is the most powerful person in Davao City, and you had to do what he wanted. It wasn't possible not to not obey his command." End quote. This is tab 51. When Mr Duterte became president, the co-perpetrators continued to control a structure of power. One of the first things that Mr Duterte did with his new presidential powers was to appoint his co-perpetrators from Davao to national positions in government and law enforcement, which were key to the common plan. And after he appointed Mr De La Rosa as chief of the PMP, Mr De La Rosa used his new powers to move other police co-perpetrators into key policing roles. These new appointments expanded the geographic powers of the co-perpetrators and allowed them to create a larger network of individuals they controlled. Your Honours can see that structure of power on the chart on your screens. The co-perpetrators controlled the police, they controlled the Drug Enforcement Agency, the National Bureau of Investigation, and the Department of Justice. And they used this control to ensure that their subordinates carried out the plan to neutralise alleged criminals through violent crimes. For example, as PMP chief, Mr De La Rosa now controlled some 180,000 police officers, who, as you have heard, he directed to neutralise drug personalities. Mr La Peña now controlled 1,800 Philippine drug enforcement personnel. They used these subordinates as physical perpetrators to commit the crimes. Mr Aguirre, as Secretary of Justice, now had control of the National Prosecution Service. He used this control to ensure that, except for a handful of low-level perpetrators in notorious cases, the crimes were not prosecuted, and a climate of impunity prevailed. And the co-perpetrators controlled the will of the physical perpetrators. As in Davao City, low-level members of the national network risked losing their jobs or being killed if they did not comply. For example, Your Honours can see the evidence of a police insider on your screens. He said that if his boss did not kill enough people during police operations, he would lose his post and be replaced. I quote, "We were told that there should be 5 to 10 deaths per month. The regional director called him and told him that if there were no deaths or no recorded killings, then he would be relieved of his duty." End quote. That's tab 124. Now on your screens is the evidence of an individual who police suspected of involvement in drugs. He surrendered to police to avoid being killed. The police held his status as an alleged drug pusher against him and recruited him as an asset. They made him kill other civilians who were alleged to be involved with drugs. He said, quote, "I surrendered myself to them. I knew that they wanted to kill me, so I became an asset of theirs," end quote. That's at tab 22. Your Honours, I will now turn to the requirement of an essential contribution. Mr Duterte made an essential contribution to the crimes within the framework of the Common Plan. And the prosecution has set out 10 of Mr Duterte's contributions in our brief at paragraphs 44 to 58. Many of these have been discussed in the prosecution's presentations. For example, Mr Nichols spoke about how Mr Duterte designed and disseminated the policy in this case, which is point A on the slide. He also spoke about point B, how Mr Duterte established and oversaw the DDS. I have just addressed point E, on the appointment of key personnel to positions which were crucial to the execution of the crimes. Mr Jeremy has spoken about point J, how Mr Duterte publicly named so-called high-value targets who were then killed. And all members of the prosecution have touched upon point H, Mr Duterte's public statements authorising, condoning and encouraging killing. Your Honours, without Mr Duterte's essential contribution, the crimes in this case would not have been committed, or they would have been committed in a significantly different way. We can see this in the evidence of low-level members of the Davao Death Squad and the National Network, who said that Mr Duterte's conduct had a causal effect on their perpetration of the crimes. You can see on the screens, one low-level perpetrator during the mayoral period said, I quote, "I was confident to continue killing people because anyway, we wouldn't be arrested for that," end quote. That's tab 38. A low-level police perpetrator during the presidential period was asked about the impact Mr Duterte's public speeches had on his team, including when deciding to kill someone. He responded, quote, "It did have an effect on me because it's like I was saying to myself, well, even the president, he himself is ready to do something like this, and who am I?" End quote. That's tab 142. A senior police officer during the presidential period was asked why his police unit started killing in July 2016. He responded, I quote, "Because of the directive of the president," end quote. That's tab 120. Your Honours, from everything you have heard over the past 2 days, there can be no doubt about Mr Duterte's knowledge and intent. Mr Duterte meant to engage in the conduct that has been charged in this case. He intended that the crimes would be committed, and he was aware that they would be committed as a result of implementing the Common Plan. Mr Duterte knew about the fundamental features of the Davao Death Squad and the National Network that enabled the co-perpetrators to control the physical perpetrators. And he was aware of the factual circumstances that enabled the co-perpetrators to control the crimes. Mr Duterte knew because he himself established the DDS to kill people. He repeatedly broadcast his intention to implement the Common Plan nationally if elected president. He made it clear that this would involve killing. Once he was president, he moved his trusted co-perpetrators from Davao into key national positions. And as the number of killings rose, Mr. Duterte persisted with the common plan. He praised the 32 killings in a one-time big-time operation in Bulacan. He publicly named so-called high-value targets. He promised to protect police. And as Your Honours have heard, Mr. Duterte has admitted to many of these things. Your Honours, I will conclude my presentation by recalling two items. The first is Mr. Duterte's presidential campaign promise that he would stop drugs and crime in the Philippines within 3 to 6 months. And the second is the spread of killings during the first 6 months of Mr. Duterte's presidency.
I promise you, hindi naman believe yung ibang tao. Sabi ko, I would stop drugs and crime, criminality in 3 to 6 months.
That concludes the prosecution's submissions on the merits. Thank you, Your Honours.
Josh Motach. Thank you very much. Am I to understand that you have finished with the presentations on the merits?
Good afternoon, Madam President, Your Honors. Yes, that is correct.
You know that you still have some time, right?
Yes, but we've hopefully been efficient, and we have finished now. Thank you.
Donc maintenant, je donne...
Now, I'll give the floor to the legal representatives of the victims for their submissions on the merits. You have the floor. Thank you, Madam President. Our presentation shall be in two parts. I will start with my presentation, and my colleague Andres will conclude later on. And just to be sure, I have 30 minutes. Is that correct? Answer correct. Thank you.
Madam President, Your Honours, we speak today on behalf of thousands of victims and surviving families who have suffered immeasurable harm under the so-called anti-drug campaign conducted during the administration of the suspect, former President Rodrigo Roa Duterte. We speak for families who cannot be here, mothers who buried their sons, children who lost their parents, the spouses who now raise families alone, and communities that have lived for years under fear and silence, and that continue to bear the consequences of violence that swept through their neighborhoods like a storm. These victims appear today before you, not as mere statistics or distant figures, or images in report as pictured yesterday by the defense, but as human beings whose rights under the Rome Statute have been violated in the most profound ways. These proceedings relate to what has been labeled the Duterte's war on drugs and Duterte's bloody war on drugs. However, the campaign, as I will refer to it during my presentation, was less about combating the drug trade itself and more about policing poverty and social inequality. As the evidence on the record unequivocally shows, individuals targeted by Mr. Duterte anti-drug operations overwhelmingly came from impoverished communities where social mobility is limited and opportunities are scarce. Drug use, particularly methamphetamine, locally known as shabu, is often more prevalent in such low-income settings where people may turn to substances as a coping mechanism for their harsh living conditions. In these communities, structural conditions, including the absence of adequate mental health services, limited access to quality education, scarce employment opportunities, and the chronic stress associated with poverty, create an environment in which substance use is more likely to emerge. Therefore, patterns of drug use do not arise in a vacuum. They reflect deeper systemic inequalities and long-standing patterns of socio-economic marginalization. The campaign disproportionately affected the poor and marginalized, especially in urban informal settlements marked by high levels of poverty. While the rhetoric of war focused on eradicating drug dealers and users, it was the most vulnerable members of society, those with the least power and resources, were caught in the crossfire. A significant number of the ones killed had little or no criminal history and were often accused of minor drug-related conduct or perceived drug use by the authorities. These were people living in poverty, were treated as expendable by a system that failed to prioritize their protection and to address the structural conditions underlying their struggles. Rather than addressing the root causes of drug addiction, such as poverty, lack of education, unemployment, and inequality, the Duterte administration framed the issue as a criminal one, focusing on punitive enforcement over social responses. Mr. Duterte's response was a selective, violent crackdown of the most vulnerable, recasting conditions of marginalizations as grounds for criminal targeting, rather as manifestations of social injustice. Framed on its face as a campaign against illegal drugs, it in reality reflected broader social political dynamics, including the targeting of marginalized communities, the use of state violence, and the deflection of attention from deeper structural problems. Mr. Duterte is charged under Article 7(1)(a) of the Rome Statute with the crimes against humanity of murder and attempted murder allegedly committed between 1st November 2011 and 16 March 2019 in or around Davao City during the period in which he was mayor of the town, and across the Republic of the Philippines during his term as president of the country. The prosecution presented ample evidence showing that each of the contextual elements of crimes against humanity is satisfied at the required threshold for confirming the charges. During the period covered by the charges, the Davao Death Squad and the national network created by Mr. Duterte to commit the crimes carried out an attack against the civilian population within the meaning of Article 7(2)(a) of the statute, as reflected in a course of conduct involving the commission of multiple murders and attempted murders. The victims' accounts of events corroborate the prosecution evidence and show that the crimes they suffered were not spontaneous or isolated acts of violence, but rather a planned, directed, and organized attack against them. The attack was massive, carried out collectively with considerable seriousness, and directed against a multiplicity of civilians. The victims were all civilians. The repeated lethal operations were conducted in residential and other civilian settings. As already indicated, the victims largely came from marginalized communities, were suspected by the authorities of involvement in criminal, often drug-related activities, and together with their families, they were targeted in their homes and neighborhoods. The attack was widespread and systematic. and we refer, Your Honor, to Annex D and E of the prosecution pre-trial brief. The attack was widespread because of its large-scale nature and the number of victims. In this regard, the number of victims affected by the events within the charges is one of the most relevant factors to be taken into consideration for the purpose of determining under the chapeau of Article 7.1 of the statute whether the attack was widespread or systematic. The broad geographical spread of the victimization, combined with a significant number of victims, confirm the wide scope of the attack. As the prosecution has made clear yesterday and today, the instances of murders and attempted murders in the document containing the charges and in the pre-trial brief are simply illustrative of a much broader pattern of victimization. In fact, the actual scale of victimization extends well beyond the 49 incidents affecting 78 victims presented by the prosecution. The prosecution itself referred to thousands of civilians murdered. And we recall here the content of paragraph 73 of the prosecution pre-trial brief, as well as the remarks by Ms. Croft just 15-20 minutes ago. As reported by Human Rights Watch in a report published in 2022, since 2016, the Philippine police have admitted its involvement in the death of more than 6,200 people in drug raids across the country. In a 2020 report, the United Nations Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights reported 8,663 deaths occurred in the drug war. The Human Rights Commission of the Philippines and domestic human rights groups report death tolls that are 2 to 3 times higher than the UN figure. The attack was also systematic, well-planned, and well-executed, following a standard modus operandi. In many cases, it began with an individual receiving a visit or a phone call from an official from the local barangay, informing them that they were on a drug watch list drawn up by barangay officials and the police. In practice, these visits function less as warnings than as a means of confirming the identity and whereabouts of the intended target. As one victim reported, I quote, "A barangay official told my husband to surrender to the police because he was on the watch list as a drug user. He had given up drug use months earlier, so didn't go. 2 weeks later, 3 armed masked men wearing bulletproof vests arrived at our home in Manila and handcuffed him. I could hear my husband begging for his life from outside the room. We were crying, and the other armed men threatened to kill us as well. Moments later, my husband was shot dead." End of quote. Survivors, relatives, and neighbors consistently recount that armed men typically work in groups of 2, 4, or a dozen. They wore either police uniform or civilian clothes, often all black, with their face concealed by balaclava-style headgear, masks, baseball caps, or helmets. They carried handguns. As one victim explained, and I quote, "On 6 June 2017, at about 9:45 in the evening, I was at home with my husband, and our children were sleeping upstairs. 4 unidentified men wearing helmets and bonnets arrived at home looking for my husband. They broke down the front door, I started begging them to spare the life of my husband. The man pushed me away. My husband was shot in the chest and fell face down. While lying face down, he was shot 5 more times in the nape and head. The children woke up terrified because of the gunshots. End of quote. Attackers frequently travel by motorcycle, typically with 2 individuals on a single bike. Often a van, invariably white or black, and at times bearing markings associated with police vehicles was also present. They banged on doors and barged into rooms. The attackers did not identify themselves or provide warrants. Family members report hearing beatings and their loved ones begging for their lives. And I quote again from the recollection of one of the victims. 5 masked armed men broke into our house in Bulacan province where my father was playing cards. We could see him kneeling in a surrendering position. The men grabbed him and slammed him into a concrete wall several times. And then, just they throw him outside. We saw the shooting. We were just there. My father's face was bleeding from being hit, and he was begging them for mercy when he was shot. End of quote. Another victim explained, quote, my father collapsed to the floor but still tried to move, begging for his life. Yet the man continued shooting him. I couldn't count how many times I was so afraid. We also heard successive gunshots from outside. Later we found that also 2 of our neighbors were killed. End of quote. The shooting could happen immediately, behind closed doors or in the street, or the victims would be taken away by the gunman only for shots to be heard minutes later and the body to be discovered by local residents. At times, bodies were dumped elsewhere, sometimes with hands tied or heads wrapped in plastic. Relatives typically found them after being alerted by policemen or by the neighbors. A victim recalled, quote, 6 masked armed men broke into the house where a small group, including several teenagers, were watching television. The men arrested and beat 2 young boys they believed were drug suspects and then took them away on motorcycles. A half hour later, after hearing from a uniformed policeman, we, referring to the relatives, rushed to a nearby bridge to find their bodies, both with gunshot wounds to the head, their hands tied with cloth. The gunmen were still at the scene, while uniformed police cordoned off the area. Another victim recounted, quote, a week after his brother was killed, 10 police officers, some in civilian clothes, arrested my other son and took him to the local barangay office. That evening, masked armed men abducted him from the barangay office. Shortly afterwards, his body was found under a bridge a block away. When we found him, we saw that his entire head had been wrapped in packing tape and his hands had been tied behind his back. He had been shot execution style through the mouth. End of quote. And another one, quote, the body seemed like it was just thrown out. The nails were removed, one eyeball was missing, stuffed by cotton. End of quote. relatives and witnesses often saw uniformed police in the immediate surroundings of the incident, securing the perimeter. Special crime scene investigators typically arrived within minutes. In numerous cases, an unregistered 38 or 45 caliber gun and a packet of shabu were found placed beside the body. And instead of fleeing from the police, the gunman would mingle with them. As one of the victims described, I quote, "On 7 June 2018 in the morning, I was at home where I saw my son coming back from his work on the opposite side of the street. Suddenly, I saw 8 policemen, 3 in uniform and 3 in civilian clothes. 2 of them crossed the street. They took my son and banged his head against the wall. They accused him of selling shabu. He denied. He was then taken to the door of the house. He was shouting, 'Mama, help me!' I took a piece of wood and hit one policeman. Suddenly, one policeman pointed the gun against my son. He shot twice, at the head and at the chest. While in shock, I saw one police officer placing 4 packets of shabu and a gun around the body of my son." End of quote. The same account of another victim who simply recalled, "After the shooting of my son, who was only 19, uniformed police showed me his body in the house and a 45 caliber handgun next to his body. I told them that my son could not afford and did not possess a gun, and therefore could not possibly have attempted to shoot at the police. I said he cannot even pay the rent. His sister paid the rent for him." End of quote. On occasions, victims were still alive when found by the relatives and taken to the hospital, where they later succumbed to their injuries. Survivors recount the terror and enduring feeling of still being hunted as follows, and I quote, "In September 2016, a police officer pretending to be a commuter boarded my tricycle. He asked me to pass by the police station. There, I was stopped by a group of men who turned to be police officers. I was taken to the precinct, beaten, and forced to reveal the identity of drug pushers. I didn't know. Later that evening, I was taken to a dark place and shot multiple times. Despite the injuries, I managed to escape and save my life. I still have the consequence of the injuries, and I feel deep sadness, anger, and fear of being caught again." End of quote. Another survivor explained, quote, "They killed my 4 friends kneeling and defenseless. I heard a barrage of gunshots, voices, and one officer saying, 'Let it be. Let's say they fought back and let's leave the evidence.' I lay next to one of my friends pretending to be dead. When the armed officer left, I crowded out of the room and headed towards the edge of a ravine. Holding my chest with one hand to stop the bleeding, I slid downwards and fell to the creek bed. I crossed it, climbed the hill on the other side, and walked toward the highway. There, I encountered someone I knew and desperately begged for help." End of quote. Although the charges concern only the crimes of murder and attempted murder, victims' accounts also reveal widespread acts of torture, ill treatment, and rape. Young people were particularly exposed to torture and cruel inhuman treatments, including unlawful arrest. A number of victims participating in these proceedings were minor when they were attempted to be killed, and a number of victims participating in the proceedings recount the killing of their nephew, son, cousin, who was under 18 at the age of killing. And this morning, Mr. Jeremy provided the example of Kian de los Santos, who was 17 at the time of his killing. Reported forms of torture include beating, kicking, slapping, blows to the head, electrocution, and death threats. On several occasions, law enforcement officials used arrests, inclusion in the drug watch list, and drug-related accusations as a tool of coercion to perpetrate rape and other forms of sexual violence. In September 2018, a young boy was taken by the police and brought to the precinct. His mother recounted, I quote, "At the precinct, he was repeatedly coerced into confessing a crime he was accused of. If you don't admit, your life will be the price," they threatened him. When he refused to confess, he was beaten with a gun and electrocuted. On the night of 16 September 2018, between 9 and 10, I received a phone call from my cousin urging me to go in a certain location in Manila. What I saw was a nightmare. My son had been discarded like an animal, his lifeless body lying on the boulevard, abandoned like a fish by the roadside. I rushed to the scene, but I was blocked by the police. I was not even allowed to touch or embrace my son's body. Even in death, my son was not treated with dignity. It was like they just threw my son out like a pig. I finally found him at the funeral home, where I had to pay to recover the body. I had nothing. I was bargaining as if I were buying fish. In the end, I paid approximately 45,000 pesos to take my son's body for burial. Now I wonder, will justice ever be served?
Excuse me, Counsel, you have 5 minutes left.
Official police reports of these incidents invariably invoked self-defense to justify the killings, despite eyewitness accounts that portray the killings as cold-blooded murders of unarmed individuals. To bolster their claims, the police routinely planted guns, spent ammunition, and drug packets beside the bodies. While these official accounts contrasted markedly with the ones provided by relatives, they were notably consistent among themselves, typically characterized the incidents as by-bust anti-drug operation, differing little besides the names, places, and dates. The victim was invariably described as a dealer who attempted to sell to undercover officers conducting a buy-bust operation. Specialized local anti-drug units, called Station Anti-Illegal Drug Special Operation Task Units, were usually involved. According to the reports, the victim, after being put under arrest, often uncuffed, allegedly pulled out a weapon and sought to shoot the police. In every case, the victim was killed, and none of the arresting officers were armed. In most cases, the police reporting having found shabu on or near the victim's corpse, and sometimes a gun. Often, after the killing, the bodies of the victims were brought directly to the funeral parlors. Families then had to start their calvary to find the body of their loved ones, and they had to pay high fees to retrieve the bodies. R/50082/25 had to sell the house to be able to pay for her brother's funeral and burial. Sometimes the bodies were instead left on the street or thrown into the water in a plastic bag. I believe it's a good time to stop for the flow of the speech. Thank you very much, Your Honor.
Merci beaucoup, Maître.
Thank you very much, Ms. Masida. The hearing is now suspended, and we shall resume at 2 p.m. Thank you very much.
Itong pre-trial hearing dyan sa International Criminal Court sa may The Hague, the Netherlands. Ako po muli si New Mercado at nakatutok pa rin kayo sa special coverage na INQUIRER.net ng pre-trial hearing ni Pangulong Rodrigo Duterte dyan sa International Criminal Court sa The Hague, the Netherlands. Kanina po, narinig natin magsalita si ICC Prosecution Trial Lawyer Robin Croft kung saan idinitalye niya kung ano ba yung, at pinaliwanag niya kung ano ba muna yung mga elemento ng crimes against humanity. Again, kung ating pong matatandaan, si Pangulong Rodrigo Duterte po ay inaakusahan ng crimes against humanity of murder and attempted murder over the killings that happened in the Philippines from November 1, 2011.
Iloilo City's transformative platform known as Wheels by Mayor Jerry P. Treñas made a huge difference. Wheels
Laban sa illegal na droga. So yung speech po kanina ni ICC Prosecution Trial Lawyer Robin Croft, hinati niya sa dalawa. So yung una, gusto niyang ipaliwanag kung ano ba muna yung mga elemento ng crimes against humanity at bakit ito yung kaso na kasalukuyang kinakaharap ni dating Pangulong Rodrigo Duterte. Ikalawa ay gusto naman din niyang maipakita kung ano ba yung individual responsibility o ano yung kung bakit ano yung responsibilidad, ano yung naging role ni dating Pangulong Rodrigo Duterte dito naman sa crimes against humanity charge na nakasampa laban sa kanya dyan sa may ICC. So, himayin natin to isa-isa para mas maintindihan ng ating mga nanonood ngayong araw. No? Itong paliwanag ni Lawyer Robin Croft dyan sa may pre-trial chamber ng ICC. So, mayroong tatlong elemento yung crimes against humanity according sa kanya. Una, there should be an attack against civilian population in the Philippines, and the attack targeted individuals alleged to be involved in drug-related crimes and other forms of criminality. As sinasabi niya dito, may target ang mga civilian sa Pilipinas, and in the case of this particular charge against President Rodrigo Duterte, ang target dito ay yung mga individual na involved umano doon sa illegal na droga at iba pang krimen dito sa Pilipinas. Pangalawa, kailangan itong mga pag-ataking ito ay kalat, widespread, at may sistema na sinusunod. Ina-argue na dito is mayroong sinusunod na pattern o systematic at widespread. Itong pag-implementa ng war on drugs ni dating Pangulong Rodrigo Duterte. At pangatlo, the attack should be carried out pursuant to state or organizational policy. Dapat mayroong polisiya ang gobyerno na para ma-implementa itong war on drugs ni dating Pangulong Rodrigo Duterte. And in this case, ang sinasite nila ay yung order that allowed the war on drugs on a national level. Na doon nga sa order na yon at diniscuss kanina pa ni Attorney Edward Jeremy ay yung paggamit ng word na neutralize, which in law enforcement ang ibig sabihin ay to kill. So sinasabi dito ni Attorney Robin Croft na because of that use of the word neutralize, yun yung nag-allow, yung polisiyang yun ang nag-allow dito sa war on drugs ni dating Pangulong Rodrigo Duterte. So, hinati niya muli ito mula doon sa local level papunta doon sa national level. Sinimulan niya yung diskusyon dito sa panahon na mayor pa lamang ng Davao City si dating Pangulong Rodrigo Duterte. At ito nga yung unang count na kinakarap niya yung sa Davao Death squad. So para mas pag-usapan pa itong diskusyon ng prosecution kanina, makasama ulit natin si Attorney Ruben Carranza. Attorney Carranza, maraming salamat po sa inyong oras.
Salamat din.
Attorney, so medyo hinihimay-himay natin no itong naging inilatag ng prosecution over the past couple of hours. So kanina inilatag ni Attorney Edward Jeremy itong second count, which is yung doon sa targeting at pagpatay sa mga high value targets, at yung pangatlo charge which is focused on the Oplan Tokhang or yung mga barangay level na operations during the war on the drugs. At ito naman si Attorney Robin Croft, pinaliwanag naman niya yung basis at ano ba yung naging role ni Pangulong Rodrigo Duterte dito sa Crimes Against Humanity charge na kinakarap niya dyan sa ICC. Ano po ang masasabi ninyo doon sa paglatag ng prosecution? Dahil tapos na po yung kanilang oras para maglatag ng kanilang mga ebidensya.
So, dalawang bagay ang dapat siguro tandaan ng mga nanonood. Una, confirmation of charges hearing lang ito. It's only a confirmation of charges hearing. This is not a trial, which means only the lawyers, the prosecution lawyers are speaking. In an actual trial, and this case could go onto a trial, you will hear witnesses. You will hear yung mga sinasabi ng ICC Prosecutor's Office lawyers na itong insider witness na ito nagsabi na ito ang ginawa kay Espinosa, or itong witness na to na binanggit rin ni Paulina Masida, no, yung legal representative for yung Office of the Public Counsel for Victims, itong biktima na to na naka-witness, sinabi niya ito.
Persisted with the same dishonest theme, and I quote his words, "We did not assist the ICC. We continue with the very tenor of the letter that we did not assist the ICC and we did not have any contact with them." So he said, but with a document emanating from the prosecution team opposite and disclosed to us a mere week ago, not as information material to the preparation of our defence, but as exonerating evidence, we can now substantiate what we have suspected for a long time. The document comprises a transcript of a telephone call covertly recorded between 4 parties who cannot be mentioned in public, and one of these parties was boasting about how he was acting as the silent partner of President BBM, managing a scheme to funnel witnesses to this court while all the time ensuring that he could guarantee President BBM's plausible deniability. So it is indeed the defence case that President Ferdinand Marcos Jr. set out to neutralise Rodrigo Duterte and his legacy. Yes, Mr. Deputy Prosecutor, I used that legendary word, neutralise, so central and so essential to your case theory, because you know just as well as me that I'm using the term metaphorically. And now I turn to the substance of the charges, but before I do, a word or two about the geopolitical context. The scourge of illegal narcotics is not unique to the Philippines. As we all know, it afflicts Latin America, where I can name 3 countries where the death rate at the hands of vigilantes and law enforcement agents per capita population is higher than it ever was under Duterte. And as you should know, and you will hear from the prosecution, at any rate, the Philippines as a country is uniquely positioned to act as a transit hub for the trafficking of narcotics emanating from the cartels in China. And with or without Duterte, so we argue, the death rate would have kept on rising. Indeed, as we will prove with statistics and reports, the death rate flowing from narcotics-related crime actually increased after Rodrigo Duterte left power. And where, I ask you, has the International Criminal Court been seen that Rodrigo did anything, the totally lawful Duterte campaign against illegal drugs and their suppliers took place when his administration was after the declaration of martial law. And it was on that significant day that Rodrigo Duterte was exposed to the tyranny of oppression and the abuse of power by the elite. and he took a decision. On that day, he chose to devote himself to a life of selfless public service. As a professor at the local police academy and as a public prosecutor in Davao, Rodrigo Duterte developed a lifelong passion, some would say an enduring obsession, for law and order, something for which he unapologetically enforced throughout his time as mayor of Davao City. Not, as the prosecution say, through sowing murder and mayhem, but through winning the love, respect, and admiration of his fellow citizens, the very same citizens who continued to re-elect him time after time, term after term, on no less than 7 occasions over more than 2 decades. And throughout his 20 or so years tenure as the mayor of Davao, Rodrigo Duterte and his family transformed that city from an outpost of communist insurgency and criminal violence into what is now one of the safest cities, not just in the Philippines, but in the entire world. This was indeed the so-called Davao model, which the prosecution wants to persuade you was code for unbridled criminal violence. And this was the type of leader that the Filipino nation wanted in 2016. So, Rodrigo Duterte was elected into power, not in spite of, but specifically because of his firm and uncompromising commitment to upholding law and order. And after his election as president, Rodrigo Duterte remained a man of the people, without seeking to patronize the people. Gung-ho in his ways and with a belligerent tone, he spoke the tough tongue of the street, not the dissembling discourse of international diplomacy. He said what the people wanted to hear, but he said it in a way that offended sensibilities of world leaders unaccustomed to hearing it, one in particular, and that was what set him on the slippery slope to a prison cell in The Hague. And let me tell you how it works. It starts with the media, controlled by the powerful. Detractors, a man whose hyperbole, bluster and rhetoric, once published, became a natural target for privately funded NGOs and human rights activists, a loose collective more commonly known as civil society. These people descended upon the Philippines to advance an agenda even more lacking in objectivity than that of the media, and heavily funded by tycoons with even grander designs. They print their glossy reports, replete with iconic photographic images of grieving families and dead bodies in rain-swept, nighttime crime scenes, all dramatically illuminated with the fluorescent glow of neon. Images carefully crafted to shock the conscience and to sway the emotions, and, I may say, to be used by the prosecutor when they don't even relate to the charges. And they gave their slick reports bold titles lifted straight out of a James Bond movie, such as License to Kill, One Shot to the Head, You Can Die Any Time, or simply, They Just Kill. The photographers are fated and their shots exhibited as art all over the world, and the brave journalists who act as their sources win awards and Nobel Prizes. And slowly but surely, their narrative becomes the sacred, unchallengeable, and unshakable truth. And so the pressure builds up, and the academics who haunt the corridors of the progressive left law faculties far away in the United States tweet their research and publish their articles pontificating about crimes against humanity, systematic attacks against the civilian population, and they point their finger at one man alone, and bandy about slogans such as accountability and the prevention of impunity. They give their gratuitous advice on what should be done, sometimes academics who formerly worked alongside the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court. Communications and complaints are filed, and the rest, as they say, is history. In any event, we're not gathered here today to judge a man on the basis of his coarse attitude or his vulgar language. This court has convened a confirmation hearing to verify whether substantial grounds exist to believe that Rodrigo Duterte, the people's president, together with various so-called co-perpetrators, over the years of his governance, devised a criminal policy of wholesale and wanton murder. And since we are in a court of law, it is worth stressing, although I should not have to, cases are decided on the basis of evidence, not supposition, not rumour, not spicy gossip, and certainly not on the basis of political rhetoric and bluster. Because at the end of the day, were it not for those belligerent and controversial speeches, there would have been no impetus to bring the people's president to The Hague. And when the prosecution's evidence is examined, I would ask you to keep an open mind and to question not just whether that evidence has been selectively presented, but whether there exists evidence which the prosecution has failed to produce. And I say this with justifiable cause, particularly with respect to the Duterte rhetoric, as we will prove during the substantive part of our submissions. The notorious speeches on which the prosecution relies have been cherry-picked to suit its narrative, while ignoring the many other speeches when the former president tempered his bombastic language by clear reference to the principle of lawful self-defense. We, the defense, have read as many of these speeches as we can find. In fact, in our poky little office on the top floor of the furthest building away in this complex, we have a counter which ticks and ticks. And whenever we come across a speech which contradicts the prosecution's murder theory by reference to self-defense, we give a cheer. And the counter goes up once more, and we celebrate one more nail in the coffin of the prosecution's case theory. As the statistics stand as of today, in contrast to the 20 speeches on which the prosecution relies to prove incitement to kill, we have found 35 more which say the complete opposite. Let me give you 2 examples from the very speeches that the Deputy Prosecutor himself cited today. Let's refer first of all to the famous Pietà speech, which the Deputy Prosecutor referred to. So, this is what the Deputy Prosecutor said. Those of you who are still sober, those who haven't tried illegal drugs, if you don't want to die or get hurt, don't rely on the priests, including human rights advocates. They won't be able to prevent deaths, and so it goes on. But if we look further on in the very same speech, something which maybe the Deputy Prosecutor didn't do, this is what he had to say. To our police officers and other officials, do your job, and you will have the unwavering support of the Office of the President. I will be with you all the way. Abuse your authority, and there will be hell to pay, for you will have become worse than criminality itself. Well, there you are. You have it straight in your face. PECSO, exonerating evidence within what is claimed to be the prosecution incriminating evidence. I won't take up my time by showing you the second speech, but there is one. If I have time at the end, I will show it to you. So if you add to that another 10 speeches out of the 20 speeches on which the prosecution rely in its document containing the charges, after all, we are in a court of law and we rely on evidence. And what is the evidence that's produced of these speeches? 20 of them. 10 of them, I submit, and we will show this in the substantive part of our submissions, contain exonerating evidence.
Sabi niya, ito yung mga nagdulot sa mga tao sa mga may hirap na komunidad na to turn to...
The 10, which we've identified in the prosecution's 20, to our total of 35, we come to 45 speeches versus 10, which we say support the use of force only in self-defense. That is 350% more speeches in favor of our defense and 354% more reasons not to confirm the charges. And you can bet your bottom dollar that at the end of today's proceedings, either the victims self-styled legal assistant to ICC counsel, or a prosecution intern will be tasked with scouring the web, looking for the means to prove Kaufman wrong. And I will declare it, and I'll declare it loudly and clearly, as if the prosecution didn't know it already. It's not enough to state that since the former president made those extremely inflammatory statements and deaths occurred, that he must, as a matter of course, be criminally responsible for those fatalities. At this stage of the proceedings, the prosecution needs to show substantial grounds to believe that the former president actually desired and foresaw that people would be killed as a result of his incendiary language. For the prosecution to assert that Rodrigo Duterte hoped for deaths to occur or was recklessly indifferent as to whether deaths would occur, which he was not, that's insufficient. So once more for the record, Rodrigo Duterte's language was aimed not at suspected drug pushers as the prosecution would have it, but directly at those poisoning society with their substances, and not, I stress, with lethal intent. His rhetoric was calculated to arouse fear and obedience, to instill fear in their hearts, and to inculcate a respect for the law in their minds. Nothing more, nothing less. That was his intent, and it was not criminal. And as many of these drug pushers demanded to enter prison, I remember seeing the images on the television, lining up to surrender and to enter prison. Now, I challenge my colleagues opposite to prove otherwise, because as we all know, in a criminal process, the burden of proof is on the prosecution. They brought this case and they need to prove it. Rodrigo Duterte need not convince the world of anything, and that is to his fortunate advantage given his current medical condition. He stands behind his legacy resolutely, and he maintains his innocence absolutely. Now, I turn to the general fairness and objectivity of the investigation, which, as we all know, is meant to be an impartial evidence-gathering exercise. As an ex-prosecutor myself, I'm used to investigating agencies pursuing all reasonable lines of inquiry, assimilating all testimonies, and digesting all documentation and forensic evidence, recommending who to target for prosecution, but not so with this prosecution. When we, the defence, study the course of the investigation in this case, one thing is plain as a pikestaff. The chief prosecutor of this court, Mr. Karim Khan, not only failed miserably to carry out his duties under the Rome Statute, requiring him to examine exonerating circumstances as well as incriminating, but he single-handedly contaminated it, so we alleged, by pursuing a one-track crusade with a view to a predetermined objective. Let me explain. Although the ICC officially authorized an investigation into the so-called Philippines situation in late 2021, it was deferred a few months later back to the Philippines for the official investigation to resume only in late 2023. But the real meat of the investigation into Count 1, relating to the activities of that fictitious construct, the Davao Death Squad, had effectively started way before then, with the sole objective of nailing Rodrigo Duterte. Indeed, all the way back in 2018, during its so-called preliminary examination, the prosecution had an individual who will be referred to as P1 handed to them on a silver platter. This P1 had been interviewed at an earlier date by none other than Chief Prosecutor Karim Khan, in his former capacity as a private lawyer, and the self-professed legal her preparation. And what was this information with which Karim Khan had helpfully provided her? A book on which the prosecution relies as evidence. A trashy, scurrilous item of pulp fiction entitled Duterte Harry. Your Honours, the picture on the front cover of that book says it all. It really does scream objectivity, doesn't it? I say that sarcastically, of course. Fortunately for us, the defence, the appeals chamber, has now disqualified Chief Prosecutor Karim Khan from this case. A welcome development as a matter of ethical propriety, but in our opinion, too late in the day to salvage the integrity of the investigation that he had supervised. An investigation in the course of which he concealed his former role as the victim's counsel, who had deemed our client a suspected murderer as far back as 2018 and right up to the very day before this pre-trial chamber issued its arrest warrant. Your Honours, over the next few days, we hope to convince you of the wholly insufficient nature of the evidence against Rodrigo Duterte. We will show you that the paltry number of speeches on which the prosecution rely do not manifest criminal intent. We will also convince you that as hard as they tried, the prosecution's investigators couldn't get even one of its criminal cooperating witnesses, whose reliability is next to zero, to admit that they heard the former president, Rodrigo Duterte, give an order to kill at any time relevant to the charges, or with respect to any of the incidents. And we hope that when you conclude your deliberations, Your Honours, that you will dismiss these grievously misplaced and politically motivated charges. We will ask you to send Rodrigo Duterte back to his family, and we will ask you to give back to the Filipino people their tatay digong. Thank you, Your Honours.
President, Your Honours, by way of an opening statement, we convey the views and concerns of the 497 victims authorized to participate in these proceedings. At the outset, Your Honours, we communicate the very deep disappointment of the victims at the decision allowing Rodrigo Duterte not to be present in this stage of confirmation of charges. The sight of Mr. Duterte being read and being confronted with the grave and horrible charges against him would have constituted a vital component of justice for the victims. This case symbolically represents the last boat that the victims can board to go on a journey in search of justice for their loved ones who were brutally killed upon the orders of Mr. Duterte. If this chamber prevents the boat from sailing by not confirming the charges, the victims will forever be moored in an island where the nights are filled with the screams and cries of their massacred loved ones. There is absolutely no other recourse for the victims. No less than former Philippine Justice Secretary Crispin Remulla admitted just a few months ago that the door to domestic justice is permanently closed for victims of the Duterte extrajudicial killings. Remulla declared, and we quote, "It is difficult to prove the case here and build up the case because those who need to speak are involved in the crime. There's nothing, not even a police report. You don't have a scene of the crime, you don't have ballistics, you don't have DNA." Remulla further declared, and I quote, "Everything that could be erased was erased so that the cases would not push through. That is why this has reached the ICC." Under the Philippine justice system, Your Honors, no criminal case can reach the courts unless they are initiated and filed by the Department of Justice or the Office of the Ombudsman. From Justice Secretary, Remulla has been appointed as Ombudsman. So the two gatekeepers of justice are successively occupied by a ranking official who has declared that there is absolutely no hope for domestic justice for the victims. If the charges are not confirmed in this case, one of the gravest concerns of the victims is that Mr. Duterte will return to the Philippines as a conquering hero, he will resume preaching his gospel of impunity. In fact, if Mr. Duterte could threaten to slap the judges of this court, which he did while he was president, this chamber should imagine the kind of terror-filled threats and the violent actions that can easily be used against the victims if the suspect walks free from this court. If the charges are not confirmed, it is a very serious concern of the victims that Mr. Duterte will be portrayed in history by his multitude of followers as the leader who vanquished the ICC and who cleansed his country of 30,000 rapists, murderers, and dangerous criminals, which were the scornful words he sweepingly used against all those who were killed in his murderous spree. Your Honors, Mr. Duterte has been in detention here in The Hague for almost a year now, but there has been no peace and rest for the victims. From the time their loved ones were killed and continuously up to this time, they lived in constant fear for their lives. The arrest and detention of Mr. Duterte has not stopped impunity in the Philippines. The virus of impunity that he spread all over the country has become a cancer that has metastasized, infecting millions of Filipinos. Mr. Duterte has created clones of himself. He converted millions of peace-loving citizens into bloodthirsty disciples who have become converts to the belief that violence and killings are valid solutions to societal problems. The killings masterminded by Mr. Duterte continue to have consequences for the victims even to this day because of his clones. These mini Dutertes harass, threaten, or commit outright violence against the victims and their families. As shown by the number of victims participating in this proceeding so far, many still fear to come out and tell their stories of how their lives became a living hell as a result of Mr. Duterte's crimes, and because they are constantly terrified of being targeted with violence by Duterte fanatics. Many victims have been hesitant to participate in this ICC case because they live in communities that thrive with Duterte clones. They see the halls of power of their country teeming with Duterte disciples. They see and hear senators, congresspersons, mayors, governors, and powerful public figures who are mini Dutertes. The daughter of Mr. Duterte is the vice president, and she has just recently declared that she is running for president in 2028. One Duterte son is a congressman. Another is the Davao City mayor, and his grandchildren occupy positions of power. The plague of impunity has spread not only among Filipinos in the Philippines, but even among expatriate Filipinos in faraway lands like here in The Hague. When we reported to the victims that we, their external legal representatives, feel like fugitives.
Apologies, counsel, it's 11 o'clock.
When we reported to the victims that we, their external legal representatives, feel like fugitives who avoid our own countrymen here in The Hague,
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much.
By the pause. Over to you, legal representative for victim, please.
Thank you, Your Honors. I was in the process of explaining the spread of impunity in the Philippines, and I will resume, Your Honor. The plague of impunity has spread not only among Filipinos in the Philippines, but even among expatriate Filipinos in faraway lands like here in The Hague. When we reported to the victims that we, their external legal representatives, feel like fugitives who avoid our own countrymen here in The Hague because chances are they are Duterte clones. They express their utmost concern that if we, their lawyers, feel threatened by mini Dutertes in a foreign country, we should imagine the far more intense fear they live with every day in their communities teeming with mini Dutertes. The victims also wish to convey that if the judges of this honorable chamber can be subjected to online harassment by Duterte clones, we should imagine the level of vulnerability the victims are exposed to in their poor villages. Your Honors, there is only one solution to stop the impunity propagated by Mr. Duterte from continuing to bring harm and suffering to the victims. And that is for this honorable chamber to confirm the charges so that witnesses can testify and evidence can be presented on the horrible crimes committed by Mr. Duterte. The testimonies and evidence presented will inoculate these mini Dutertes from the virus of impunity that has infected them. When they will see and hear the utter cruelty, the sheer brutality, in other words, the brazen inhumanity of the crime.
Ako rito at ikulong ako rito, pero pwede mo ring sabihin yan sa harap ng ICC. Ba't ayaw niyang sabihin sa harap ng ICC?
And this is a personal question, Attorney Carranza, but I hope you can give me an answer to this. No, what does he get from it? What does he get from refusing to acknowledge and recognize the jurisdiction?
If that happens, an even more serious condition of impunity can take place in the Philippines, possibly worse than the orgy of violence that happened from 2011 to 2019, and this time there will be no ICC to run to for assistance and help. The victims humbly beseech this honorable chamber to reaffirm the two crucial objectives of the ICC identified in the preamble of the Rome Statute. First, to prosecute and punish the most serious crimes that deeply shock the conscience of humanity. And second, to put an end to impunity and to contribute to the prevention of crimes of unimaginable atrocities. If this chamber confirms the charges, this court will achieve its first objective of prosecuting and, if convicted, punishing Mr. Duterte for the unspeakable crimes he is charged with. But achieving the first objective will not automatically make this court attain its second objective. Merely putting forward the evidence gathered and the theory of liability of the prosecution will not necessarily resolve the second objective. This court should allow victims to testify, and the record of the proceedings reflect the harrowing experiences of those impacted by against humanity. It is the brutality. In other words, the utter inhumanity of the crimes masterminded by Mr. Duterte, so that the people who adore and idolize him, the people who have become disciples of impunity, will see for themselves the inhumanity of the suspect. For this to happen, the charges should all be confirmed. The virus of impunity that has spread all over the Philippines is very grave and serious, Your Honors. Imagine a leader like Mr. Duterte, who proudly and publicly proclaimed his aspirations of following the footsteps of Adolf Hitler when he said, quote, "Hitler massacred 3 million Jews. Now there are 3 million drug addicts. I'd be happy to slaughter them," unquote. And yet, he is worshipped by a huge number of Filipinos. In so many countries, you will need to hide your adoration of Hitler. Mr. Duterte flaunted it, and his fanatics are unaffected by it. Mr. Duterte has pronounced so many other horrible declarations meant to promote and encourage impunity, as it will be detailed tomorrow by my colleagues. And yet, he is idolized by a multitude of Filipinos. The defense will claim that he was merely bombastic and acerbic when he made these statements. But if he were merely being pompous and flippant, the people who were killed should be alive and laughing today at his supposed pranks and stunts. Mr. Duterte did not only order the mass killing of people suspected of being drug personalities, Your Honors. He smeared them with accusations of being rapists, murderers, and dangerous criminals. Mr. Duterte imposed an inflexible condemnation that if you are a drug personality, you are automatically a dangerous criminal who has engaged in unimaginable atrocities. The families of those killed did not only suffer the loss of a loved one, their families were even disgraced with being associated with a rapist, murderer, or dangerous criminal. Even after their loved ones were murdered, many families were subjected to deplorable injustices. Instead of gunshot wounds as cause of death in their death certificates, families were shocked to see pneumonia, heart attack, stroke, sepsis, and other false causes of death that were instead written down. Other families were charged substantial amounts, sums the impoverished families could not afford, just to retrieve the bodies of their loved ones from the funeral parlor who were suspected by the families of being in cahoots with the police officers. Some family members were even arrested and imprisoned by police officers on false charges and for the purpose of preventing them from complaining. In one particular incident, Your Honors, a young man and his common-law wife were sleeping in their shanty when men in civilian clothes knocked down the door to their house. The men dragged the wife out of the room. The husband was already surrendering, and he even started to strip naked to show he had no drugs or firearm on his body. He said in the Filipino language, "Sir, malinis po ako, maghuhubad ako, sir." Translation in English, "Sir, I am clean. I will strip naked, sir." Still without mercy, the men shot and killed him. After killing the husband, they arrested the wife and accused her with falsified and non-bailable charges. When the deceased mother and cousin went to the police station to find out what happened to the young man, because they were not in the scene of the crime when it happened, the two were also summarily arrested and charged with fabricated crimes. If the Honorable Chamber confirms the charges in this case, the witnesses and evidence will show that those who were smeared by Mr. Duterte before they were killed, they were inside their houses, sleeping peacefully with their families, eating meals with their loved ones, playing with their children, or hugging their wives. Others were merely walking along the street, having snacks at the roadside eatery, or plying the road, earning a poor man's living. They were all doing ordinary, peaceful, and plain human activities. Confirming the charges will restore the dignity of those who were killed and the honor of their families. The prejudice suffered by the families of those killed did not begin and end with the killings of their loved ones. Each killing set off a chain reaction that is continuously churning out a daily crucible of harm, damage, and loss. By masterminding the mass murder of mere suspects, Mr. Duterte has brought irreparable and endless harm to the families. An overwhelming majority of those killed were the sole breadwinners of poor families. These families were dependent on each day's wage for their daily sustenance. They were hand-to-mouth families. With the death of their breadwinners, the widowed spouses, a majority of whom are women, have had to take on the roles of two parents. On top of taking care of their children and maintaining the household, the widowed spouses now have the additional burden of being breadwinners for their families. Families have been driven to even far more serious destitution, Your Honors. The damage to the children is immeasurable. Their development and upbringing have been permanently compromised. They have been walking through life with one missing parental limb. Losing a parent under very dire economic conditions and under the most violent circumstances results in wounds that will never heal and that will absolutely render them handicapped for life. And then there's the indescribable anguish of parents who lost a child. No parent is supposed to outlive a child. Parents suffer a lifetime of grief when a child dies ahead of them, and the lifetime grief is unimaginably worse when a child dies under the most inhuman circumstances. The crimes masterminded by Mr. Duterte did not only affect individuals but whole communities. Across the Philippines, numerous urban communities of the most impoverished villages were scarred by the violence and abuses wrought by a lawless anti-drug campaign that further worsened the misery and trauma of residents in marginalized communities. In one illustrative instance, Your Honors, after the father of a family was killed inside his house by police officers, the entire neighborhood was so traumatized that for almost 3 months, and during the coldest months in the Philippines, they abandoned their houses at night and instead slept in the open public market. They did not feel secure inside their houses because there would be no witnesses if the police would just barge in and shoot at them. In the public market, the presence of many witnesses, they thought, will deter the police from shooting and killing them. It is also the victim's view, Your Honors, that the charges should be confirmed because the resulting presentation of witnesses and evidence during the trial will force police and other law enforcement officers to confront the brazen depravity of the killing of civilians that they either personally committed or allowed to be committed during the Duterte reign of terror. In one operation, the police summarily killed 3 men, 2 brothers and 1 friend, in the very early morning. The police declared that the 3 were nanlaban. They fought back. But the neighbors saw otherwise. The whole neighborhood was so horrified at the macabre treatment of one of the fatalities. The bullet-ridden body of one of the 3 men was brought out from the 2nd floor window and dropped to the ground because the police could not bring the body out through the doorway. When the body hit the ground, the neighbors recoiled at hearing the body emit a cry, aray, translation in English, ouch. The man was still alive when his body was thrown to the ground, and the police just left him to bleed to death. The trial will hold a mirror to the police force and compel them to see how they were turned into executioners and assassins, and their organization transformed into a gigantic criminal organization or turned into a killing machine by Mr. Duterte. The Philippine National Police and the drug enforcement agencies have not made any initiative to purify the corrupted minds of their officers and personnel to our knowledge. The trial in this case will be a tremendous teaching opportunity that can work to rectify the warped and depraved minds of Philippine security officers. The charges need to be confirmed, Your Honors, for the sake of the entire country, which has been desensitized or made numb by the massive incidents of impunity and the glorification of impunity promoted by Mr. Duterte. The whole Philippines needs to know the real story during those bloody years. There has been no opportunity for the entire country to really find out the whole truth of what happened. It has been hush-hush, tidbits of sporadic news, and always drowned out by trolls who mass produce and broadcast false, fake, and fabricated news. The victims also attach a very important historical significance to this case. If the Chamber confirms the charges, the trial proceedings will produce a historical record of the most bloody period of post-war Philippine history, a duty that the Philippine justice system has refused to perform. The historical account on the mass murder of so many Filipinos during the Duterte regime needs to be accessible to our future generations, just like the Nuremberg trials and the Tokyo trials, so that they will learn from it and not repeat the same mistake of selecting and glorifying leaders who preach and practice impunity. The prosecution has presented 78 instances of murder and attempted murder, clarifying that these incidents are only representatives of the extent of the crimes committed against thousands of civilians, Your Honors. The victims beseech the Honorable Chamber to remember that Mr. Duterte's bloody rule, both in Davao City and nationwide, resulted in as many as 30,000 victims of killings, more than 300,000 victims of arbitrary imprisonment, and unaccounted numbers of victims of torture, sexual assault, and other forms of crimes against humanity. For many families in the Philippines, the charges brought for confirmation in these proceedings represent only a fraction of the reality the victims have endured. The victims beseech the Honorable Chamber to remember the hundreds of thousands of victims are banking on vicarious justice from this case. Finally, Your Honors.
Excuse me, Counsel, you have 5 minutes left.
Thank you. Finally, Your Honors, the victims wish to humbly underline that what is ultimately at stake in these proceedings is the supreme of all forms of human rights, the right to life. The right to life is the very foundation of every civilized society. The ancestors of every nation fought against invaders, colonizers, despotic monarchs, and fascist leaders in order to secure the right to life of their families, their communities, and the future generations. The heroes of every country sacrificed their lives to defend the right to life of their people. We as citizens of modern societies are inheritors and beneficiaries of the sacrifices of our ancestors who bequeathed to us the right to life. We owe it to them to defend the supreme legacy for our generation and for the generations to come. For the past few years, Your Honors, we have seen an increasing number of nation leaders who time-traveled from the Dark Ages and now swagger in modern times as if they own people's lives. These brutal and cruel leaders must be held to account for their brazen disregard of humankind's right to life. Our ancestors fought in the battlefield to secure a right to life. In these modern times, the battleground for the fight to protect our right to life is within the four walls of this honorable court. May the God of life, the God of humanity, guide the honorable members of this chamber. Thank you, Your Honors.
Madam President, honorable member of the bench, all those following these proceedings inside the courtroom and outside, and especially those in the Philippines. Today marks an important day for international justice for the people of the Philippines, for the victims, and for this court. The commencement of the confirmation hearing against Mr. Rodrigo Roa Duterte is a reminder of the court's unwavering commitment to its mission to investigate and prosecute individuals for the most serious crimes of concern to the international community and to bring justice to the thousands of victims of the mass crimes and atrocities perpetrated in the Philippines. It is also a reminder that those in power are not above the law. Your Honors, over the course of the next 20 minutes or so, I will provide an overview of the evidence in this case that demonstrates that Mr. Duterte is responsible for the charged crimes. And my team will then develop aspect of this evidence in more details. This case before you today, it is before you today because there are substantial ground to believe that Mr. Duterte is criminally responsible for those three counts of murder just spelled out and attempted murder as crimes against humanity. These charged crimes were committed during the time within the court jurisdiction, which is between the 1st of November 2011 and 16th of March 2019. At first, they were committed in and around Davao City, where Mr. Duterte was a mayor, and then expanded across the rest of the Philippines when he became president. Mr. Duterte is charged with 49 incidents of murder and attempted murder of 78 victims, including children. These murders and attempted murders were part of a widespread and systematic attack that overall resulted in the killings of thousands of civilians across the country during the relevant time frame. Thus, the charged incidents are merely a fraction of the overall criminality that resulted from Mr. Duterte's so-called war on drugs. What is Mr. Duterte's core contribution? Your Honors, Mr. Duterte played a pivotal role in the commission of the charged crimes. His contribution was essential, as he was at the very heart of the common plan to use his words, to neutralize alleged criminals in the Philippines, including through murders. The victim included individuals associated with or perceived to be associated with drugs. One of the first things Mr. Duterte did when he became the mayor of Davao back in 1988 was to create the infamous Davao Death Squad, otherwise known as DDS. As you will have seen from the prosecution pre-confirmation brief, Mr. Duterte personally instructed Death Squad members that their mission was to kill criminals and suspected criminals, including drug users and dealers, also referred to as drug pushers. The death squads carried out this mission well into the charge period through 2011 to 2016, perpetrating the crimes charged in count 1. Your Honors, Mr. Duterte's criminal plan and his intent were no secret. He not only shared them with his co-perpetrators and members of the death squad, but also made them abundantly clear to the general public in the numerous public statements that he made time and again. During his presidential campaign, Mr. Duterte explicitly vowed to implement the common plan to neutralize alleged criminal nationwide if elected. This was his program to be elected. He publicly announced his intention to eradicate corruption, criminality, and drugs in 3 to 6 months And this is what he said. I quote, "If I become the president, I will order the military and the police to hunt down the drug lords, the big ones, and kill them." That's what he said. And this can be found at tab 12 of the prosecution list of material. Similarly, when speaking about druggies, I quote, in a televised interview in 2015, this is again what he said. "If I become president, you will all get wiped out. I will order your execution within 24 hours. That's what he said. That I quote directly from his word. And this quote can be found at tab 19.2 of the prosecution list of materials, ERN PHL OTP 401684, page 003, and these are the lines 82 to 83. And elected he was. And becoming president on 13th of June 2016, this provided him with the opportunity to follow through with his promise and to expand extrajudicial killings of alleged criminals beyond Davao and across the rest of the Philippines. He did this through the implementation of the National Anti-Illegal Drug Campaign, better known as Duterte's War on Drug, and its project, Double Barrel. These were carried out by the national network consisting of law enforcement personnel working together with non-police assets and hitmen. Mr. Duterte authorized murder and personally selected some of the targets. During the mayoral period, when he was mayor, his clearance was required for the DDS to carry out the killings. Essentially, members of the DDS needed Mr. Duterte's green light to murder. And during the presidential period, Mr. Duterte has continued to personally identify some of the targets, including by publicly naming those he claimed were involved in illegal drug trade or in other forms of criminality. On the list, you will be killed. And this was a word of one prosecution witness. And this evidence can be found at tab 54 of the prosecution list of materials, ERN PHL OTP 00015 page 0009, and the relevant lines are 260 to 261. Mr. Duterte provided moral and financial support to the direct perpetrators as well. In a 12 December 2016 speech, Mr. Duterte admitted that he used to ride around Davao on a motorcycle looking for trouble, so he could kill. And he said, and this again his own word I'm quoting here, "In Davao, I used to do it personally, just to show the guy that If I can do it, why can't you? And these are his own words. And this quote can be found at tab 16.1 of the prosecution list of material, ERN PHL-OTP-000015547 at 0002 lines 7 and 8. And the evidence show that Mr. Duterte's Davao City Mayor office provided some member of the DDS with a regular salary. Financial rewards were also given to direct perpetrators in the form of cash per head of killing. And at a press conference in 2013, Mr. Duterte stated that shoot to kill orders and reward are, and I quote him, are legitimate tools of government to fight lawlessness. This is his own word. And if he surrendered to me or his carcass dead, then I double the price. And again, yeah, and that was what he boasted. This quote can be found at tab 17.2 of the prosecution list of materials, PHL-OTP-000094932 at 0002, and the relevant lines are lines 7 to 11. Deaths of drug personalities killed in anti-drug operation were endorsed by Mr. Duterte's administration and listed as official accomplishment in public reporting. Your Honors, as you will have seen the confirmation brief, Mr. Duterte also provided the direct perpetrators with weapons, ammunition, and logistical support to facilitate the commission of the charged crime. And he also had control, wide control over those crimes. And let me now turn specifically to that control.
Ano, gusto niyo patayin? Sino patayin? Pwede mo kayo pumatay. Dalawa naman kayo. Kayo mo na biktima. Puntahan niyo. Buhusan niyo ng gasolina. Yung bahay, sinihan niyo.
Mr. De La Rosa made this speech on the 25th of August, 2016. At the time, he was the chief of the Philippine National Police. Your Honours, the existence of the policy is also shown by the police directive which Mr. Jeremy spoke about earlier, Command Memorandum Circular number 16 of 2016. This is at tab 112. As Your Honours have heard, the day after Mr. Duterte became president, he appointed his longtime friend and colleague from Davao, his co-perpetrator, Mr. Ronald De La Rosa, as chief of the Philippine National Police. On the same day, Mr. De La Rosa formalised the anti-drugs component of the policy by issuing this directive to the 180,000 police officers under his command. The circular directed police to pursue the neutralisation of illegal drug personalities. As Mr. Jeremy has outlined, the evidence shows that within law enforcement, neutralise meant and was understood as meaning to kill. Your Honours, the Command Memorandum Circular shows there was a policy to neutralise through violent crimes such as murder. I will now turn to part 2 of my presentation on Mr. Duterte's individual criminal responsibility.
Please be seated. Veuillez vous asseoir.
George Motta. Good afternoon to everyone. I give the floor to the legal representatives of the victims so that they can conclude their submissions on the merits. You have the floor.
Pattern or repeated operational methods, including late-night raids, forced entry without warrants, victims shot at close range, similar post-incident police reports with consistent narrative of armed resistance, non-laban, planting of drugs and weapons, and the absence of genuine investigation demonstrates a systematic attack. This pattern is not a coincidence, it is structured. The use of similar operational narrative and particular assertions of armed resistance demonstrate consistency incompatible with isolated acts. Regardless of whether the direct perpetrators were formally identified as police officers, the similar tactics used show planning and coordination involving law enforcement authorities and, at times, local officials. Killings were not carried out by rogue officials or by vigilantes operating separately from the authorities. The police involvement in the killings extended well beyond the cases officially acknowledged as death arising from by-bust operations. Furthermore, the government failure to arrest, let alone prosecute, a single police officer for their role in any of the war on drug killings that Duterte has encouraged, sent a clear message that the one responsible need not fear accountability and can act with impunity. There is no evidence that Mr. Duterte took any steps to prevent or punish the responsible for the murders. On the contrary, as his numerous public statements made clear, he discounted the legality of police actions, showing no inclination or intent to investigate alleged crimes. Mr. Duterte encouraged the police to carry out his anti-drug campaign and repeatedly stated he would protect them from prosecution. On 19 July 2016, at a fellowship dinner with his former law school classmates, Mr. Duterte said the police officer could carry out their war on drugs without worrying about being prosecuted. He stated, and I quote, "The president can grant pardon, conditional or absolute, or grant amnesty with the concurrence of Congress. I will use it, believe me," end of quote. During a press conference on 21 August 2016, he also explained that his promises to protect the police was one of the reasons why the war on drugs had become so bloody, and I quote, "Remember, I went in warning everyone. I said it could be bloody because I knew that the police would now be equipped with a certain mindset, that they will be protected by law if they go in and have this, violent confrontation. Because before, they were afraid of these human rights, and a lot of them lost their jobs because they couldn't even have a lawyer to defend themselves. End of quote. Mr. Duterte also warned human rights organizations not to file cases against police and army officers for extrajudicial killings, saying, and I quote, "I would like to say now they will never go to prison, not under my watch." End of quote. This morning, Your Honor, Mr. Jeremy referred to the killing of the mayor of Albuera, Rolando Espinosa, who was killed inside the Leyte prison. At the time, the National Bureau of Investigation determined that the killings were a rub-out of 2 unarmed prisoners inside their cell and filed murder charges. Mr. Duterte responding, saying that the officers would not be prosecuted with these words, and I will quote, "I will not allow this," meaning officers, "go to prison. I don't care if the NBA says it is murder. Anyway, the NBA and the Department of Justice are both under my authority. I will be the one to answer for it and go to prison." End of quote. On his 3rd day in office as president, Mr. Duterte publicly told police officers that he would pardon them if they kill drug dealers and drug addicts, using these words, quote, "Do your duty. And if in the process you kill 1,000 persons because you're doing your duty, I will protect you." End of quote. Given the prevailing perception of police impunity and the absence of effective investigations or prosecutions, in many cases victims did not file a complaint nor try to initiate criminal proceedings. As one family member of a victim explained to us, and I quote, "We had no hope for an investigation of the police. One of us saw one of the police go inside with an aluminium briefcase. He took out a gun and some shabu socket and placed them next to the body. I went back to where I was, and I was totally shocked. I couldn't even complain. If we go complain, what is our chance against the authorities?" End of quote. In other cases, victims tried to seek justice. They went to the police, to local officials, to government agencies. They filed reports, they asked for investigation, they begged for answers, but their pleas were ignored, their complaints were dismissed, their testimonies were doubted. In some cases, the very people they approached for help were the same ones involved in the violence. They were left with no path forward. No institution was willing to hear them, no authority was willing to protect them, no system was willing to acknowledge what was happening. The attack against the civilian population was carried out pursuant to a state policy to neutralize, through violent crimes, including murder, individuals perceived or alleged to be involved in drug-related and other crimes. The policy was originally developed by Mr. Duterte and his close associates in Davao City and implemented locally, and then expanded to the national level in 2016, once Mr. Duterte became President of the Republic of the Philippines. Victims support the primary prosecution pleading and submit that the evidence shows the existence of such a policy, as reflected in the repeated patterns of conduct, the mobilization of state resources, Mr. Duterte's public endorsement, and institutional tolerance. Mr. Duterte first ran for mayor of Davao in 1988 on a campaign to restore law and order in the city. the largest of the main southern island of Mindanao. At that time, Davao was known as the murder capital of the Philippines. Communist insurgents and government security forces gunned each other down and many civilians day and night on Davao streets and barrios. Mr. Duterte was Davao mayor for most of the years between 1988 and 2016. Local NGOs indicate that squad killings of alleged drug dealers, petty criminals, and street children in Davao City started sometimes in the mid-90s, during Mr. Duterte's second term. The group that claimed to be responsible for the killings was called Suluguon Sakatuan, or Servants of the People, amongst other names. But soon the media, as you have also heard in these days, the media began referring to it as the Davao Death Squad. The Davao Death Squad killed hundreds. Mr. Duterte endorsed the killings as an effective way to combat crime, relishing his Duterte nickname and reputation. His active promotion of the killing of suspected drug offenders led to a sharp increase in such killings during his time as mayor. According to one estimate, amongst the other that you have been shown yesterday and today, at least 1,424 such killings took place in Davao between 1988 and 2015. As you heard yesterday during the presentation of Mr. Nichols, and today during the presentation of Ms. Croft, when confronted with the death toll during his presidential election campaign, Mr. Duterte responded, "They said I killed 700? They undercounted. It was 1,700. As you also heard, Your Honors, on numerous occasions as mayor, Mr. Duterte claimed personal responsibility for the policy of killing drug suspects. Even prior to announcing his candidacy for the May 2016 presidential election, Mr. Duterte was already very clear about his intention to eliminate crime by eliminating criminals, applying nationwide the abusive crime control tactics. As reported in the Sunstar Philippines on 24 May 2015, he declared, and I quote, "If by chance that God will place me there, watch out, because the 1,000, referring to the person killed in Davao, because the 1,000 will become 100,000. You will see the fish in Manila Bay getting fat. That is where I will dump you." End of quote. 3 months after that speech, he renewed his pledge, and I quote, "If I become president, you better hide. That 1,000 will reach 50,000. I would kill all of you who make the lives of Filipinos miserable." End of quote. Mr. Duterte's outspoken vote to embark on a nationwide killing campaign against drug dealers and drug users was the foundation of his presidential electoral platform. During a campaign rally on 15 March 2016, he stated, quote, "When I become president, I will order the police to find those people dealing or using drugs and kill them. The funeral parlors will be packed." Following his election as president, as also explained this morning by Mr. Jeremy, on 9 May 2016, Mr. Duterte continued to declare unequivocally that his anti-drug campaign was focused on killing drug dealers and users. Speaking in Davao on 4 June 2016, he stated, quote, "If you are still into drugs, I'm going to kill you. Don't take this as a joke. I'm not trying to make you laugh, son of bitches. I will really kill you." End of quote. The next month, Mr. Duterte referred to children killed in his drug war has, I quote, collateral damage. Mr. Duterte and his associates disregarded the most basilar principle of law, human rights, and human dignity. In September 2016, after the then UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon denounced the drug war killings, Mr. Duterte called him a fool, adding, quote, "I will continue the campaign against the criminals. I do not have any pity for them. I don't give a shit. I am the President of the Philippines, not the Republic of the international community." End of quote. In a Human Rights Watch report issued in March 2017, Mr. Duterte's first 6 months in office were labeled as a human rights calamity for the Philippines. Mr. Duterte repeated public statements encouraging the killing of alleged drug offenders were not rhetorical flourishes. They were operational directives. The repeated calls to kill alleged drug dealers and users is indicative of a government policy to direct an attack against a specific civilian population. Public statements encourage lethal force. Law enforcement operations were organized and resourced. The rhetoric of eradication was translated into practice. The scale, coordination and continuity of operations, coupled with public encouragement of lethal enforcement, support the inference of policy. When violence is normalized, repeated, and institutionally defended, as in the present case, it reflects policy. Turning to the alleged liability of Mr. Duterte. The suspect is charged as indirect co-perpetrator under Article 25(3)(a) for committing the crimes jointly with others in furtherance of a common plan or agreement to neutralize through violent crimes including murder, individual perceived or alleged to be involved in drug-related and other crimes. In the alternative, he is also charged under Article 25(3)(b) for ordering or inducing the Davao Death Squad and later the national network to commit the crimes, and under Article 25(3)(c) for aiding, abetting, or otherwise assisting members of the Davao Death Squad and later the national network to commit the crimes. Victims submit that the evidence presented by the prosecution allows to conclude that there are substantial grounds to believe that Mr. Duterte is criminally responsible for the crimes charged. In particular, the evidence shows the existence of a common plan to kill individuals perceived by the authorities as implicated in drug-related crimes. The common plan originated in Davao in the late 80s when the suspect instructed members of the death squad, police officers and non-police hitmen, to conduct operations against the targeted individuals, provided funds and other resources to achieve the aim of the agreement. As already recalled, Mr. Duterte made unequivocal public statements encouraging police and civilians to kill alleged drug offenders. Such statements indicate an intent to use the country's law enforcement agencies to engage in murders. Mr. Duterte was proud of his achievements at the point that he put his method at the center of his presidential campaign. When elected president, he adopted the same method as in Davao nationwide and continued to state publicly and unequivocally that his anti-drug campaign would focus on killing drug dealers and users. Mr. Duterte relied on the support of the police, which he exercised effective control over, to execute the common plan. Their loyalty was reinforced through financial incentives, promotions, and the maintenance of a system of impunity. Mr. Duterte had full knowledge of the crimes. As the Chamber has already heard, on 15 March 2016 in Lingayen, he announced that if elected, he would order police to locate and kill individuals involved in drugs, warning that funeral parlors would be crowded. On 7 May 2016, the final day of the campaigning for the presidential elections, Mr. Duterte made it clear that his threats were to be taken literally, and I quote, "All of you who are into drugs, you sons of bitches, I will really kill you. I have no patience, I have no middle ground," end of quote. Madam President, Your Honors, the loss victims carry is not measured only in the death of a loved one. It is measured in the empty chair at the dinner table, the birthdays that will never be celebrated, the dreams that ended abruptly, and the futures that were taken from them. As one of the victims put it, and I quote, "My loved one was not perfect. None of us are. But he was a human being. He was someone's child, someone's parent, someone's partner. He deserved dignity, due process, and the chance to defend himself. Instead, his life ended without warning, without explanation, and without accountability. For many of us, the moment we learned of our loved one's death was the moment our own lives changed forever. We were left with questions that no one in authority would answer. We were left with fear that speaking out would put us in danger. And we were left with the painful knowledge that the institutions meant to protect us had failed us." End of quote. The trauma of these events did not end with the loss of life. It continues every day. Families were left to navigate grief while facing stigma and suspicion. Many were told implicitly or explicitly that their loved ones had deserved what happened to them. They were made to feel ashamed for seeking answers. Some were threatened when they tried to file complaints. Others were told not to bother because nothing would come of it. Children who witness violence now struggle with fear. Parents who lost their children live with enduring guilt and despair. Entire communities still carry the memory of nights filled of sirens, shouting, and uncertainty. Your Honors, the victim's suffering is never abstract nor remote. It remains real, immediate, and ongoing. Your Honors, trauma is not always visible. It resides in the silence of the ones who are afraid to speak. It lives in the hesitation of a child who no longer feels safe walking outside, and in the constant fear of families who still look over their shoulders, wondering whether they will be targeted next. For the victims, the confirmation of charges is not merely a legal step. It is a recognition that their loved ones mattered. It is an acknowledgement that what happened to them was wrong. It is a message that they have not been forgotten. These proceedings offer something they had been denied in years: hope. Hope that the truth will be established, that the one responsible will be held to account, that future generations will not endure the same suffering. Justice cannot restore their loved ones, but it can restore dignity. Justice can affirm humanity. Justice can help them begin to heal. Madam President, Your Honors, For the purpose of a confirmation of a charges hearing, the prosecution must demonstrate substantial grounds to believe that Mr. Duterte committed each of the crimes charged. Victims submit that the evidence presented by the prosecution meets this evidentiary standard. The confirmation of all charges is not only legally warranted, it is essential to the integrity of international criminal justice. The evidence before this chamber establishes reasonable ground to believe that crimes against humanity of murder and attempted murder were committed in the context of a spread and systematic attack against the civilian population, and that Mr. Duterte bears individual and criminal responsibility under Article 25 of the Rome Statute. Your Honors, the victims have waited years for this moment. They have been silenced, stigmatized, and denied justice in their own country. Today, they stand before you with the hope that justice, long denied, may finally be within reach. This court is their last refuge, and today, on their behalf, we ask this chamber to affirm that their suffering matters, that their rights matter, and that the rule of law extends even to the most powerful, by confirming all the charges against Mr. Duterte and committing him to trial. This concludes my part, Your Honors. With your leave, I will give the floor to my colleague, Mr. Andres, for concluding our presentation. Merci beaucoup.
Judge Motoj, thank you very much. Maître Andres, you have the floor.
Madam President, Your Honors, I am Gilbert Andres. My colleague, Ms. Masida, earlier submitted that Mr. Duterte's anti-drug campaign disproportionately affected the poor and marginalized. What were the conditions of the victims targeted by Mr. Duterte's anti-drug campaign? How poor and marginalized were his victims? The victims targeted by Mr. Duterte's anti-drug campaign were from low-income, high-density communities. In an urban setting, this meant that some victims live in an area of about 69,000 persons per square kilometer during the relevant period. A typical floor area of the house of a victim in these high-density communities was about 6 square meters. For some victims, their house was as small as the area of 2 tables in this courtroom. The victims' houses were typically made up of wood, used tarpaulin, plastic, light materials, and some broken hollow blocks. Any material that they could scavenge and utilize. As the victims lived in high-density communities, their neighbors knew them very well. The victims lived in close-knit communities. The victims' close-knit communities meant that they immediately knew if a person was an outsider to their community. And any traumatic event that happened to these victims in their close-knit communities was known and whispered throughout their community. As the victims were from low-income communities, to survive poverty, their houses were homes to multiple generations of their families to conserve their meager resources. For Filipinos, especially from low-income communities, their family is not just the nuclear family. It is not just the husband, the wife, the children. Their family extends to the grandparents, the lolo and lola, and the siblings of a spouse, the brothers and sisters. The breadwinner of the victim's family was usually the husband, the father of the children. The victims either worked as daily minimum wage earners or as wage earners below the prescribed daily minimum wage, or as part of the informal economy, such as a vendor. The victims work if there was work available to earn for their family's survival. But most of the victims would not have completed their education, nor have the proper training to secure stable jobs as part of the formal economy. If they were fortunate to be employed as minimum daily wage earners, in the urban setting, this amounted to about 500 Philippine pesos per day, or approximately about 8 euros per day during the relevant period. But for most victims, the minimum wage was really the maximum that they can hope for. The victims only hope to earn at most about 8 euros per day. And for a family composed of the husband, the wife, and about 2 until 4 children, 8 euros per day is meager. There was also a cultural expectation for the breadwinners to help their elderly parents. The other spouse sometimes augmented this meager income by being a vendor or by taking temporary jobs. And if both parents were outside of their home, it was the extended family that took care of the children. Your Honors, the specific data may vary from victim to victim, but the victims hope that this data give the Chamber a picture of their conditions under Mr. Duterte's anti-drug campaign. The already marginalized and vulnerable conditions of the victims exponentially multiplied the harm that they suffered, and they continue to suffer, which leads to our next submission. What were the grave effects and suffered harm of the victims, their families, and their communities resulting from the crimes charged against Mr. Duterte? Mr. Duterte's drug war campaign targeted the very humanity of the victims, of their families, and of their communities. In Filipino, the indirect victims expressed this in one sentence: "Inalisan kami ng dangal. We were stripped of our dignity." How so? First, Mr. Duterte publicly dehumanized the victims of his anti-drug campaign. This dehumanization of the victims was used to justify their eventual murders. On July 25, 2016, during his first State of the Nation address before the Philippine Congress, Mr. Duterte declared that, and I quote, "But human rights cannot be used as a shield or an excuse to destroy the country, your country, and my country." End of quote. What was chilling was that this portion of Mr. Duterte's speech garnered the most applause from members of the Philippine Congress and the public gallery. On August 17, 2016, during the 115th Police Service Anniversary at the Philippine National Police Headquarters, Mr. Duterte declared to the Philippine National Police that for those allegedly affected by drugs, and I quote, "And it has not only affected millions, but a lot of them are no longer viable as human beings in this planet." End of quote. On August 26, 2016, Mr. Duterte declared to a group of Filipino soldiers he visited in an army camp that, and I quote, "Crimes against humanity? In the first place, I'd like to be frank with you. Are they humans? What is your definition of a human being?" End of quote. These public speeches of Mr. Duterte serve to condition the Filipino people on the excuse for the murder of the victims of his anti-drug campaign and how the murders were taken out, brazen, execution style. These public speeches of Mr. Duterte were emblematic of findings that atrocity crimes were often preceded by the process of dehumanizing the identities of others to justify the crimes. Second, the murdered victims were dehumanized by how they were murdered. During their actual murders, the targeted victims were summarily accused as drug users or pushers without the benefit of a judicial process, just like the one before this chamber. The victims were then murdered inside their homes or within their own close-knit community. The victims who were murdered inside their homes were murdered in front of their family, their spouse, their children, or their parent, especially in front of their mothers. Some of the victims were forcefully separated from the physical clutches of their family members, protecting them from the direct perpetrators of Mr. Duterte's anti-drug campaign. This was what happened to the son of a victim in the early hours of a Thursday. At that time, this victim, her son, and her son's wife, who was pregnant and nearing delivery, were preparing to go to the hospital when 6 or 7 people dressed in black and who had guns suddenly entered their house. As recounted by this victim, and I quote, "My son kept repeating, 'Mama, don't leave me.' So I blocked the way. He pleaded again, saying, 'I will come with you, just don't kill me. Mama, don't leave me.' 4 officers were inside. One shouted at me, 'Get out of the way!' They pulled me down the stairs and yanked my hair. They had guns. My son pleaded again, 'Mama, don't leave me.' He was hugging, referring to his wife. They dragged me out into the street and put me on a motorcycle. Some victims begged the direct perpetrators for their lives, as witnessed by their family members. Some victims spontaneously took off their clothes to show to the direct perpetrators that they were clean. The home, which was supposed to be a shelter of security for the direct victims, became the crime scenes of their brazen murder. The targeting of the victims in their own homes is explained by the Philippine National Police Command Memorandum Circular number 16-2016, which was earlier referred to also by the prosecution. It was issued on July 1, 2016, by the then Chief of the Philippine National Police, Ronald Bato de la Rosa, appointed by Mr. Duterte. The relevant portion of CMC 16-2016 states that, and I quote, "The actual house-to-house visitations of suspected drug personalities shall be the highlight of Project Tonghang." End of quote. Project Tonghang refers to Mr. Duterte's anti-drug campaign on barangay clearance operations. Ultimately, the murdered victims were now known in their close-knit communities with the stigmatized label of natokhang and as drug users, despite the lack of any judicial declaration. Third, the murdered victims of Mr. Duterte's anti-drug campaign were further dehumanized even after their death by the false narrative of nanlaban. After the actual murder, the murdered victims were falsely portrayed as nanlaban, that they allegedly fought back against the police despite being the helpless victims. After the murder, evidence of illegal drugs and/or paltik guns were even planted on the murdered victims as part of the modus operandi of the anti-drug campaign to allegedly show that the victims purportedly fought back. Thus, the murdered victims were not only known as natokhang and as drug users, they were also now known in their close-knit communities with the false label of nanlaban, or someone who fought back. But for the surviving family members of the murdered victims, the suffered harms do not end there. The extreme trauma brought by the sudden murder of the Tokhang victims was further carried over to their surviving family members. Some of the surviving family members were even imprisoned and charged with fabricated criminal complaints while they were still grappling with the trauma of the sudden attack and the murder of their loved ones. For the victim I earlier referred to, after her son was forcefully separated from them, she and her son's pregnant wife were both arrested and detained in a police precinct. While under detention, she was told to get her son from the morgue. But they were not actually released from detention. They were actually photographed with the foils and rocks handed to them, and afterwards they were charged with fabricated complaints relating to illegal drugs, as that victim narrates. And I quote, "While in detention, I learned that the same thing had happened to all the other detainees. Their stories were the same. It took more than a year before this victim was released from imprisonment. The illegal imprisonment of surviving family members was part of the modus operandi to prevent the indirect victims from filing criminal complaints against the direct perpetrators of Mr. Duterte's anti-drug campaign. Thus, the document containing the charges in paragraph 19 refers to, and I quote, other violent crimes under Article 7.1, end of quote. Further, as the homes of the murdered Tokhang victims were the homes of multiple generations, how the murdered victims were brutally shot at have been traumatically witnessed by their family members, by their spouse, their children, or by their parents. This extreme trauma is a daily struggle for the surviving family members as they still live every day in the scene of the crime, their homes. This extreme trauma of the surviving family members also occurs when they see or about to encounter a police officer, or worse, the direct perpetrator in their community. But the extreme trauma of the surviving victims does not end there. The surviving victims were socially stigmatized in their close-knit communities with the label, "Natokhang sila," or "May natokhang sa kanila," which loosely translated means they have a family member killed in a Tokhang operation. The surviving family members of the murdered victims were avoided and shunned in their close-knit community. The neighbors avoid the surviving family members, fearing for their own lives by reason of association with the murdered Tokhang victim. And the surviving family members usually mourn alone during the wake of their murdered loved ones. For some surviving family members who cannot endure this social isolation and continuing stigma, they eventually leave their close-knit community. The trauma and stigma are especially worse for the children of the murdered Tokhang victims. Aside from losing a parent, usually their father, who is the breadwinner, the children, as direct descendants of the murdered victims, were avoided at school or even bullied as the children of Natokhang. The children of the murdered Tokhang victims have to endure bullying, stigma, trauma, depression, and some even develop symptoms such as epilepsy. And because the murdered Tokhang victims were usually the breadwinners of their families, their death meant that their surviving family members were pushed toward further poverty. The surviving family members experienced extreme socio-economic dislocation with the murder of their breadwinner. Thus, Mr. Duterte's anti-drug campaign, aside from murdering victims from low-income communities, also brought about the breakdown of the families of the murdered victims. Mr. Duterte's anti-drug campaign destroyed the trust in the close-knit communities of the murdered Tokhang victims and ultimately destroyed the social fabric of these communities. Ultimately, Mr. Duterte's anti-drug campaign not only murdered people, but perpetrated state terror against low-income, marginalized communities across the Philippines. As a result, Mr. Duterte's anti-drug campaign shattered and terrorized these close-knit communities as a means of control. And ultimately, as the targeted victims of Mr. Duterte's drug war campaign were from marginalized, vulnerable communities, his drug war campaign was not really a war on drugs. It was a war against the poor. And the continued stigmatization of the indirect victims, the surviving family members, still persists until now. The children of the murdered victims are still suffering psychologically, mentally, and socio-economically. Their widowed mothers and their extended families, the grandparents, usually the grandmother, or aunts or uncles, also bear the burden of providing for the children of the murdered victims. And some surviving family members are still being visited or watched by the direct perpetrators to check on them. Last, what do these proceedings mean to the victims? The proceedings before this chamber are being watched intently by the victims because they see it as their first step towards the truth and towards justice. There is still a culture of denial that subsists even in the close-knit communities where the victims reside. The family members of the murdered victims still cannot openly discuss the murder of their loved ones in their close-knit communities. and some quarters supportive of Mr. Duterte even publicly claim that these murders under the drug war campaign allegedly never happened or were merely fake news or were justified as necessary. These hearings on the confirmation of charges are vital to the victims of Mr. Duterte's anti-drug campaign because it will be the first step for them in actualizing their right to the truth and to justice under international law. Madam President, Your Honors, the victims know that their murdered loved ones suffered under the charge of crimes against humanity for murder being charged against Mr. Duterte. Your Honors, the victims know, they have seen with their eyes, they have heard with their ears, and they have witnessed the barbarity of the murder wherein their loved ones' human dignity was never respected. Thus, the victims pray that this chamber confirm the charges for crimes against humanity for murder against Mr. Duterte for the sake of the truth and for the sake of justice for the victims. And so that the murderous legacy of Mr. Duterte's anti-drug campaign will not find new victims in the future. Madam President, Your Honors, thank you for your time and kind attention. This ends the submission of the Common Legal Representative for Victims. May it please the Chamber.
Judge Motok.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much, Mr. Andres. I gather that you have finished. So this second day of our hearings has come to an end. In accordance with our schedule, the hearing is suspended until Thursday, 26 February at 10 in the morning. Thank you, parties, participants, our interpreters, the registry, technical staff, and all those who have worked on this hearing and allowed it to be held. I wish you a pleasant day, and we will see you on Thursday. The hearing is adjourned.